The morning sunlight streamed through the window of the Manhattan high-rise, bathing Elizabeth Montgomery's office in a golden glow. Elizabeth stared intently at the pristine white envelope on her desk. Her name was written in elegant script, with gold trim adorning the edges of the envelope. For 3 days, she had been unable to open this invitation. "The materials for your 10 o'clock meeting are ready," said Jennifer, her secretary, who appeared after a knock at the door. Elizabeth snapped back to reality. "Thank you. I'll be there in about 5 minutes." After Jennifer left the room, Elizabeth sighed deeply and finally opened the envelope. As expected, it was an invitation to her sister Caroline's wedding. The words, "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Caroline Montgomery and James Wilson," gleamed in gold foil. For Elizabeth, who hadn't had a meaningful conversation with her family in over 10 years, this invitation stirred complicated emotions. The memories of being called useless and the child who could never do anything right throughout her childhood still left deep wounds in her heart. Caroline, in particular, had received all of their parents' affection and shone as the family star. Compared to Caroline, who was always praised for her academic and athletic achievements, the introverted Elizabeth with her average grades naturally became a shadow within the family. Why can't Elizabeth be more like Caroline? Follow Caroline's example. Are you two really sisters? These words were uttered countless times by Martha and George Montgomery. As she grew older, Elizabeth gave up trying to meet her family's expectations and resolved to forge her own path. After college, she began studying real estate with her modest savings and scholarships, and started investing in small properties. The first few years were a continuous struggle, but her keen eye and perseverance began to pay off. When she looked at dilapidated buildings, she could see their potential value. At 29, Elizabeth made her first profit exceeding $1 million. It came from a project converting a practically derelict Brooklyn warehouse into a trendy office space. Now her company, Montgomery Investments, had become one of New York's most successful real estate investment firms, and Elizabeth stood shoulder to shoulder with many prominent investors. But even with success, the rift with her family remained unbridged. She particularly remembered the pain of being dismissed with, "Don't ruin your life with such a reckless venture," when she once tried to discuss her investments with her parents in her younger days. After that, she stopped talking to her family about her work. Their relationship had dwindled to just an annual Christmas card. Holding the invitation, Elizabeth gazed out at the New York skyline. "Perhaps this is a chance to mend our relationship," she thought. Now that she was successful and confident, maybe she could move beyond past hurts. What's more, the Grand Riverside Manor, the prestigious wedding venue Caroline had chosen, was actually a property Elizabeth had acquired and renovated 2 years ago. She gently checked, "Will attend," on the response card and sealed it. "Please mail this today," she told her secretary as she headed to her 10 o'clock meeting. What Elizabeth didn't know was that this invitation hadn't been sent with sincerity. "Dad and Mom insisted we had to invite her. But I really don't want her to come," Caroline had confided to a friend. The path to family reconciliation would be much rockier than Elizabeth imagined. Just before entering the meeting room, Elizabeth's smartphone vibrated. It was an email from the property management company, final confirmation for the event at Grand Riverside Manor on May 15th. She smiled slightly. The date matched her sister's wedding. Unbeknownst to anyone, Caroline would unknowingly be celebrating her special day in her sister's building. Elizabeth had no intention of telling her family about this. She wasn't returning to seek their approval. She was simply exploring the possibility of restoring the lost family bond. As the bustle of Manhattan continued outside her window, Elizabeth Montgomery took a deep breath and walked toward the meeting room with confident steps. Standing at the entrance of Grand Riverside Manor, Elizabeth composed herself. Her elegant pale pink silk dress accentuated her sophisticated presence, and a modest pearl necklace gleamed softly at her neck. In her right hand, she held a carefully wrapped small box, an antique Tiffany bracelet she had chosen for her sister. "You'll be fine," she reassured herself as she gracefully entered the venue. The interior was already bustling with guests. The green and white decorations created a refreshing atmosphere typical of Caroline. During the renovation of this building, Elizabeth had particularly admired the stucco ceiling and marble columns in this hall. The restoration had cost a fortune, but seeing its beauty now, she felt secretly proud. Elizabeth. Turning around, she saw her parents, Martha and George, standing there. Despite the years, Martha's refined features were still beautiful, and George maintained his robust physique. However, evident confusion marked their expressions. "Mom, Dad, it's been a while," Elizabeth said with a gentle smile. "I never thought you'd actually come." Martha's voice contained no warmth of welcome, only surprise. "I came because I was invited," Elizabeth maintained her composure. "Where's Caroline?" "In the preparation room." "The ceremony will start soon," Martha replied, checking her watch. "You should sit in the back row. The family seats are arranged from the front." Elizabeth headed toward the back row as instructed. She felt as though she'd been sent a message that she wasn't really a family member, but she didn't let it show on her face. Soon, solemn music began to play, and the ceremony started. Caroline, dressed in a pure white gown of lace and satin, radiated like an angel. Elizabeth was genuinely moved by her sister's beauty and couldn't help but pray for her happiness. After the solemn ceremony, the reception began. Champagne was poured, and guests chatted happily. Elizabeth sat quietly at a corner table, enjoying her meal while occasionally observing her surroundings. Some relatives noticed her, but most just nodded briefly, seeming to avoid conversation. "Sister, you came." Startled by the voice behind her, Elizabeth turned to find Caroline standing there in her bridal attire. Facing her sister after 10 years, Caroline had grown into a sophisticated woman while still retaining traces of her childhood. "Of course, Caroline. It's a beautiful ceremony." "Congratulations," Elizabeth stood up, smiling with genuine blessing. "This is just a small gift for you." Caroline hesitantly accepted the small box Elizabeth offered. "Thank you, but honestly, I didn't expect you to come. You sent me an invitation." "That was." Caroline's words trailed off. "Dad and Mom said we had to send it." A small pang shot through Elizabeth's heart. So she truly hadn't been wanted. Still, she maintained her composure and quietly replied, "I understand." For the next few hours, Elizabeth felt lonely but tried to behave as naturally as possible. Yet her presence clearly affected the atmosphere around her. Former relatives avoided her, and occasional glances thrown her way mixed curiosity with suspicion. "She's still single, isn't she? What kind of work does she do?" Poor Caroline, on her wedding day of all days. Elizabeth tensed at these snippets of gossip reaching her ears. But she was already accustomed to the loneliness and coldness she had experienced many times before. She had developed a thick skin to survive in the business world. Eventually, it was time to cut the wedding cake. A magnificent 5-tier cake was brought to the center, and the bride and groom smiled as they grasped the knife together. The venue filled with applause and cheers of blessing. Elizabeth also applauded wholeheartedly. At least for today, she wanted to forget past wounds and celebrate her sister's happiness. As the cake was being distributed, Caroline took the microphone. "Thank you all for coming today. I'm truly happy to spend this special day with family and friends." Warm smiles spread throughout the venue, then Caroline's gaze turned to Elizabeth. At that moment, her expression subtly changed. "By the way, we have a special guest today." Caroline's voice carried a hint of sarcasm. "My sister, whom we haven't seen for years, suddenly appeared." The atmosphere in the venue instantly changed. All eyes focused on Elizabeth. She straightened her back, feigning calm. "Elizabeth," Caroline said while placing a slice of cake on a plate. "Actually, we were talking about you. Why did you come today? We wanted to keep it to family only." Before Elizabeth could answer, Caroline walked towards her and suddenly threw the plate of cake at her. The cake hit Elizabeth's chest, with white cream spreading across her pale pink dress. "I only invited family." I didn't invite you. Caroline's scream echoed throughout the venue. After a moment of silence, Martha and George burst into laughter. Following their lead, the entire venue erupted in raucous laughter. Elizabeth felt an icy coldness as she slowly stood up. Tears welled in her eyes, but she lowered her face to hide them. No one defended her. She lightly wiped the cake from her dress with a napkin, then headed for the exit without saying a word. Behind her, the laughter and whispers continued. Outside, the evening sky was painted a beautiful purple. Elizabeth finally let her held-back tears flow. But they didn't last long. Her smartphone rang, displaying her secretary Jennifer's name on the screen. Elizabeth, there's an emergency. The manager of Riverside Manor called about a payment issue. Elizabeth wiped her tears and answered in a professional voice. I understand. I'll head to the office right away. As she got into the waiting taxi, she gazed at the wedding venue through the window. The top-floor office of Montgomery Investments in a Manhattan high-rise offered a spectacular view of the city lights spreading out when dusk fell. But tonight, Elizabeth's heart had no room to enjoy that beauty. She headed to her office, quietly suppressing her anger. Although the cake stain on her dress had been wiped off with emergency measures, a clear mark remained on the expensive silk fabric. It was visible evidence of the humiliation she had endured. Elizabeth, thank you for coming, Jennifer, her secretary, stood up to greet her. Stephen Hart, the manager of Grand Riverside Manor, is waiting online. Elizabeth nodded and went to her desk. The large monitor displayed Stephen Hart's serious expression. Thank you for making time, Ms. Montgomery, especially since I understand you had personal plans today. No problem, Stephen. Please explain the situation, Elizabeth replied calmly. There's a serious issue with the payment for the Wilson-Montgomery wedding today. The remaining 50% of the total amount, $87,500, hasn't been deposited as scheduled. The groom's father, Robert Wilson, contacted us this morning saying there was an issue with the bank procedure, but we still haven't confirmed the payment. Elizabeth frowned. According to the contract, full payment was due by the day of the ceremony. Exactly. This is a breach of contract. Further investigation revealed that the Wilson family apparently managed to scrape together the initial deposit using multiple credit cards. There were questions about their ability to pay from the beginning. Elizabeth stared at the manager on the monitor while experiencing complex emotions. Her sister's wedding was about to be ruined by payment issues. At the same time, anger still smoldered within her toward the family that had treated her poorly. Are the bride and groom aware of the situation? The groom, James Wilson, understands the seriousness of the situation, but it seems the bride, Caroline Montgomery, hasn't been informed of the details. Mr. Wilson's father insists that something will work out. Elizabeth sighed lightly. What about Martha and George Montgomery's situation? They aren't involved in the payment. It seems all wedding expenses were to be covered by the Wilson family. Elizabeth analyzed the situation while reviewing documents on her desk. Grand Riverside Manor was one of her most profitable properties, and ordinarily, strict adherence to contracts would be expected. But this wasn't just a business matter. Her family was involved. Stephen, do you know anything about their financial situation? From our investigation, the Wilson family appears wealthy on the surface, but they actually seem to be carrying substantial debt. Robert Wilson's real estate business has been performing poorly in recent years, and it's likely they're straining themselves financially for this wedding to keep up appearances. Elizabeth sat back deeply in her chair. And my parents? The Montgomery couple doesn't appear to be financially comfortable either. They seem to be living on retirement pensions. This information was new. Elizabeth had assumed her parents were wealthy, given that they always wore expensive items and took luxurious vacations. But appearances often differ from reality, a lesson she had learned in the real estate industry. Follow the standard protocol, Elizabeth made her decision. Respond according to the contract. Understood. We'll cease the remaining services and request evacuation from the facility if the situation isn't resolved, Stephen responded strictly. Don't mention my name until I give further instructions, Elizabeth added. Please don't yet reveal that I am the owner of this facility. Understood. As the call ended, Elizabeth sank deep into her leather chair. Outside the window, New York's night view began to sparkle. She noticed a tear running down her cheek. Jennifer gently knocked on the office door. Are you okay? Is there anything I can help with? Elizabeth wiped away her tears and smiled. Thank you. But I'm fine. What happened? It was a family gathering. You might call it a welcome party, Elizabeth answered with a touch of irony. Jennifer nodded without saying anything. Having worked with Elizabeth for over 10 years, she knew that her relationship with her family was complicated. Should I arrange a car for you? Jennifer asked. Elizabeth looked out the window, lost in thought for a moment. Something was changing within her. She didn't want to end this with mere revenge for the humiliation she had suffered today. She wanted to choose a higher path. She wanted to achieve true victory by demonstrating her success and dignity. Yes, please, Elizabeth stood up and adjusted herself in front of the mirror, keeping the dress with the cake stain as it was. I'm going back to the wedding venue. Really? Jennifer asked with surprise. Yes, Elizabeth answered calmly. Tonight is a special night. It's my sister's wedding. 30 minutes later, Elizabeth stepped out of a luxury car and once again stood in front of Grand Riverside Manor. The building, illuminated in the darkness of night, radiated majestic beauty. This was the result of her painstaking restoration of what had once been a dilapidated old mansion. Entering the manor, she found the atmosphere completely changed. The music had stopped, the food service had been interrupted, and the guests were talking in small confused groups. Stephen Hart noticed her and immediately approached. Ms. Montgomery, thank you for coming. The situation has worsened. Mr. Wilson cannot make the payment, and the bride, groom, and parents of both families are discussing countermeasures in the office. I understand, Elizabeth replied calmly. Please take me to that room. Walking down the manor's luxurious hallway, Elizabeth was confident in her decision. She had overcome many difficulties in her life. The humiliation from her family would become insignificant in the face of the true strength and dignity she would demonstrate tonight. In front of the office door, she paused for a moment. From beyond the door, she could hear Caroline crying and her parents and the groom's family arguing heatedly. We need to resolve this situation, or our reputation will be ruined. It was George Montgomery's voice. We intend to pay the agreed amount. We just need a little time, Robert Wilson replied. Elizabeth took a deep breath and placed her hand on the doorknob. She had returned not for revenge, but for salvation. Yet it was also an opportunity to prove her worth and success. I'm ready, she whispered quietly. The moment Elizabeth opened the office door, all conversation inside ceased. Caroline sat clutching the hem of her wedding dress, her eyes red and swollen from crying. The groom, James, stood pale-faced, and the parents of both families sat facing each other across the table. Everyone looked at Elizabeth with expressions of surprise as she appeared in the doorway. Elizabeth? Martha exclaimed with an incredulous look. You're still here. Elizabeth entered the room with composed steps. The cake stain on her dress made her presence even more striking. I've just returned, she replied calmly. Manager Stephen Hart entered behind her and bowed politely to everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Miss Elizabeth Montgomery, CEO of Montgomery Investments. CEO? George frowned. What are you talking about? At that moment, Stephen added one more statement, she is also the owner of Grand Riverside Manor. Shock rippled through the room. Caroline covered her mouth with her hand, Martha sank deep into her chair, and George stood speechless. The color drained from Robert Wilson's face. Elizabeth, you are, this building's. Caroline stammered. Elizabeth quietly signaled to the manager, who understood and took a step back. She approached the table and stood where everyone could see her. I'm sorry such problems have arisen on this wonderful day, she said in a controlled voice. Stephen, may I see the contract? The manager immediately handed her the file. Elizabeth carefully opened it and reviewed the contents. Before her agitated family, she maintained professional composure. Regarding the wedding of Mr. James Wilson and Ms. Caroline Montgomery, $87,500 remains unpaid, Elizabeth stated matter-of-factly. According to the contract, the full amount was to be paid by today. Robert Wilson cleared his throat and began to explain apologetically. Ms. Montgomery, I acknowledge the payment is delayed, but I assure you, I will take responsibility. Mr. Wilson, Elizabeth gently interrupted. In business, there are principles. A contract is an agreement between both parties, and adhering to its conditions is expected. The atmosphere in the room froze. Caroline began to cry again, and James placed his hand on her shoulder to comfort her. Elizabeth gazed at Caroline. Just hours ago, this sister had thrown cake at her and made her a laughingstock. But now, before her stood a woman facing the moment when her dream was crumbling. However, Elizabeth quietly continued. Today is a special day. Everyone held their breath, waiting for her next words. Caroline, this is your wedding day. A once-in-a-lifetime special occasion, Elizabeth said, lightly touching the cake stain on her dress. It would be undesirable for the celebration to be ruined by payment issues on such a day. What do you mean? George asked cautiously. Elizabeth closed the contract and placed it on the table. We can discuss payment at a later date. You may continue with the ceremony tonight as planned. Caroline's eyes widened. Really? Of course, Elizabeth replied matter-of-factly. We can't disappoint the guests. I'll instruct the staff to resume the music and food service. Robert Wilson breathed a sigh of relief. Thank you, Ms. Montgomery. I promise we will. However, Elizabeth interrupted again. She took a piece of paper from her bag. This is a personal invoice. Cake charges and special cleaning costs. $1,250. This is separate from company expenses. The room fell silent. Elizabeth slowly placed the paper on the table. This is. Martha faltered. This is for the cake that was thrown at me and the cleaning cost for this dress, Elizabeth explained calmly. Business shouldn't be influenced by emotions, but I believe personal matters should be properly settled. Caroline blushed and lowered her eyes in shame. Her parents were also speechless, just staring at their daughter. After a moment of silence, James stepped forward. I'll pay it. Thank you, Elizabeth, for helping us. Elizabeth smiled faintly. Thank you, James. You seem like a good person. Please take care of my sister. I will, he answered seriously. Elizabeth turned back to the manager. Stephen, please resume all services. And tell the staff to provide the best hospitality. Certainly, Stephen bowed politely and left the room. A heavy silence fell among the remaining family members. Elizabeth slowly approached Caroline and crouched down in front of her. Congratulations, Caroline, she said softly. You're a beautiful bride today. Caroline wiped her tears and looked up at Elizabeth. Complex emotions floated in her eyes. Why? Why would you do this for me after I was so terrible to you? Elizabeth smiled gently. Because we're family. Those words resonated throughout the room. Elizabeth slowly stood up and turned to face George and Martha. Their faces showed a mixture of confusion and shame. Elizabeth. George's voice broke. You've become successful, Martha continued. We didn't know. Of course you didn't know, Elizabeth replied quietly. For 10 years, I've been quietly building my life. Montgomery Investments is now one of New York's most successful real estate investment firms. A look of surprise and regret came into her parents' eyes. They seemed unable to believe that Elizabeth, the daughter who had been called useless, could achieve such success. I'll leave the payment matter here, Elizabeth pointed to the invoice on the table. This is also a settlement of our past. Elizabeth began walking toward the door. Looking back, she saw her entire family still staring at her in bewilderment. Enjoy the ceremony. This manor is one of my favorite properties. I invested a lot of time and affection in its restoration. Before opening the door, she turned back one last time. Oh, and by the way, the taste of the cake on my dress wasn't bad. At least, there seems to be no issue with the quality of the food. With those words and a smile, she gracefully left the room. In the hallway, music had begun to play again, and the guests' conversations and laughter were returning. Elizabeth took a deep breath, held her head high, and walked toward the hall. Behind her, the office door opened, and Caroline rushed out. Elizabeth, wait. She frantically ran after her sister. Elizabeth stopped and turned around. Caroline's eyes were brimming with tears. I'm sorry, she said with a trembling voice. I'm really, really sorry. Elizabeth smiled kindly and took her sister's hand. It's okay. This is your special day. Be happy. After a moment's hesitation, Caroline suddenly hugged Elizabeth. It was their first embrace in over 10 years. Let's keep in touch from now on, Caroline said, finally releasing her sister. Really? Elizabeth nodded. Of course. But now, go back. Your guests are waiting. Caroline nodded and returned to the hall. Watching her sister's retreating figure, Elizabeth thought that this night might not be an end, but a new beginning. She walked out of the building with dignity, still wearing her dress with the cake stain. Under the starry sky, a quiet sense of satisfaction spread in her heart. A sense of having achieved not revenge, but true victory. She had finally proven her worth and gained recognition from her family. But more importantly, she had come to fully accept herself. 3 months later, on an autumn afternoon, Elizabeth received a letter in her Manhattan office. Seeing the careful handwriting on the elegant stationery, she immediately knew it was from her sister. Sitting on a sofa by the window, Elizabeth slowly opened the letter. Dear Elizabeth, since the day of the wedding, I've wanted to contact you every day, but not knowing how to put it into words, I couldn't write this letter until today. First, I sincerely apologize. On that day, and for many years before, I've treated you terribly. I won't make excuses. I now understand that from a young age, I feared being compared to you by our parents and developed an ugly competitive spirit to protect my place. After the wedding, James and I have been going through a difficult time. His family has incurred serious debt from the over-extravagant wedding costs, and his father has been forced to downsize his business. Our newlywed life hasn't been the glamorous one we initially envisioned. Instead, it began modestly in a small apartment. Our parents are in a similar situation. They've begun to realize that their pension alone is not sufficient, and they're worried about their retirement funds. Dad recently researched your company and was surprised to learn that your success was beyond what he had imagined. These past few months have made me think about the true meaning of a value. You quietly but surely paved your own way, achieving success without anyone's help. In contrast, I believed I was superior under our parents' protection, but in reality, I hadn't prepared for anything. If you can forgive me, I'd like to meet and apologize. And if possible, I'd like your advice. James and I want to make our future life more substantial. Hoping that someday we can call each other sisters again. Caroline. Elizabeth held the letter to her chest and gazed at the New York skyline outside the window. Complex emotions welled up inside her, anger, sadness, and a strange hope. She called her secretary, Jennifer, and told her, keep next Saturday afternoon free. That weekend, Elizabeth met Caroline at a small cafe in Brooklyn. Her sister was no longer as glamorous as at the wedding, dressed in simple jeans and a blouse. They embraced each other and spent a long time talking about the past and future. During that conversation, Elizabeth made a decision. She gave her sister an invitation to a seminar on investment and financial planning. I'm hosting it. It's a class for beginners. If you'd like, bring James and our parents too. Furthermore, hearing about James's dream of opening a small cafe, Elizabeth offered to help them create a business plan. You don't need to do everything by yourself from scratch. I want to share what I've learned. Over the next few months, the family relationship gradually mended. George and Martha attended Elizabeth's seminar and proudly watched as they witnessed their daughter's knowledge and talent firsthand for the first time. They acknowledged their mistakes and asked Elizabeth for forgiveness. On Christmas night, Elizabeth was invited to a dinner hosted by Caroline and James at their newly opened cafe, Montgomery Brew, in Brooklyn. On the wall hung the words, "Real family means supporting each other." When Elizabeth raised her glass to propose a toast, a gentle light shone in her eyes. What she had found was not revenge or victory, but reconciliation and healing. And most importantly, she had finally fully recognized her own worth. To a new beginning for our family, she raised her glass. To a new beginning, everyone in the family echoed. Outside the window, snow continued to fall quietly, wrapping the city in white. As past pains healed and new bonds were woven, Elizabeth Montgomery's life had finally come full circle.